Well, hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Jarrett, and I'm a Senior Distinguished Fellow at the University of Chicago Law School. I'm also board chair of When We All Vote and co chair of the United States of Women. I used to be a senior advisor to President Obama at the White House, and I'm now a senior advisor to his foundation. And it is in those last two roles that I had the opportunity, I should say the privilege, of working with the Brennan Center for Justice. And so I am so delighted to be hosting tonight as we have a conversation about our democracy and exactly how we're going to fix it. So, in addition to the Brennan Center, which is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University School of Law, we are partnering with and producing this event with NYU's John Brennan Center, which is dedicated to debate on politics, public policy, and other major issues facing our world. And so, given everything going on in the world today and in the United States, what a timely opportunity it is for us to have a conversation about our democracy. So, the 8 years that I spent in the White House were just extraordinary. And I have to tell you, I don't miss the pressure cooker. I don't miss picking between bad and worse alternatives. I don't miss Congress. But what I do miss more than anything else are the people. And so I'm particularly delighted to have a chance to interview one of those very extraordinary public servants with whom I had the chance of working very closely in the White House, David Litt. So the last time I met David Litt, I was actually interviewing him. But we'll get into that in just a moment. Not only did he come on board and he wrote speeches for me, but then he moved on up, you might say, and became a speechwriter for President Obama, always adding a little wit to all of his speeches. And the ones that you will remember most notably were the correspondence dinners, where President Obama, after he would deliver these very witty speeches, he would say, "Why is everyone so surprised that I'm funny? I'm always funny." But a lot of that humor goes to the credit of David Litt. He moved on from there to What Better Place, Funny or Die, the Washington office. And there he was in charge of lead producer and writer. And then he's become an author. He's beat me. He's out with his second book now. And in order to do the book, and David, I know you're on. I want you to hold it up. Hold up your copy of the book. I don't have a hard copy, so I want you to hold it up so everybody can see your book, Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. It's a mouthful, but a really good read. And in order to prepare for the book, David traveled the country, which is a privilege. I will say one of the highlights of the last 15 years of my life is having the chance to see so much of our great country and have conversation with all kinds of folks to try to figure out, why is there sometimes a disconnect between we the people and what actually happens in Washington or in state houses or around the country? How do we more closely align the will of the people with the work that is done by public officials? And frankly, in the climate we're in right now, living through the worst pandemic in our lifetime with the COVID-19, and recently, of course, the extraordinary outpouring of support we've seen through peaceful demonstrations around the country around the issue of the breach of trust between police and communities of color. And in a sense, it's laid bare and been a history lesson for why our democracy is so important and why government, the institution of government at each level, is so important. And so that's what we're going to get into with David tonight. So, David, let's start off with a softball question. So, which was easier, being my speechwriter or writing a book about Mitch McConnell? Welcome to the conversation.
Yes, that's right. And Valerie, I swear I had not remembered this until recently, but like minutes ago, as I was waiting, I remember that one of the things I said in my first book was that working for you, I learned how important it was to be prepared because you had an extraordinary talent for asking the one question that I was not prepared for. And so now you have graciously agreed to ask me a whole bunch of questions, and I foolishly am excited about it. So thank you for being part of it. And it is really an honor. And I will also say, when I started writing a book about democracy, my first stop, I think literally my first stop, was to talk with Michael and visit the Brennan Center. So this is, in so many ways, it's a real honor.
You're in good hands. So, all right. So I'm not going to make you answer the question about Mitch McConnell because I'd like to think working for me was easier, far easier. Although you did you did really, really get, I think, under his skin with this book. That would be my guess. But
That's
let's
my
jump
hope.
right into the more serious questions that I have for you. So in researching this book about our democracy, and obviously given the climate that we're living in, tell us a little bit, reflect a bit about the moment we're in and how you think your book weaves in the message that would be resonating with folks around the country right now.
Well, I wrote this book for exactly the reason that you described, and I think President Obama has spoken about it more eloquently, not surprisingly. But there's this gap in so many ways between what we want and what our government does. And when President Obama was in the White House on many, many issues, it meant that change was much harder than it felt like it ought to be. I mean, I remember Valerie used to talk about the president's plaque that he had on the desk that said, "Hard things are hard." But I also remember thinking at times, are hard things really supposed to be this hard, especially when you have a mandate from the voters? And that extends all the way to this basic question of, are we getting the leaders who we vote for? In so many cases in American life, we're asking for one set of leaders and we're getting a different set of leaders. And then finally, I think the other thing that drove me to write this book was this understanding of this broad feeling that just I did not really fully understand how our government works. And, I worked in the White House. I worked for you in the White House. I took AP government in high school. I can quote all the words to Schoolhouse Rock, and yet something seemed to be missing. And so I wanted to try to pop the hood, so to speak, on our republic and see how our system is really working and why it isn't, and figure out what is it that we can do together to change it. Because I think that ultimately is the promise that has brought so many people to this work. I mean, it's the thing that got me involved in politics. Back when I thought I was going to be a comedy writer when I grew up, I remember seeing Barack Obama give a speech after the Iowa caucuses, and he said, "People who love this country can change it." And he described that as the most American of ideals. And so in a way, the book is about history and it's about political science, but it's also just about that most American of ideals and how we keep that alive.
Great. All right. Well, so we're going to go into a little vocabulary lessons, and you're going to help us understand some of the words that you use in the book. They also relate to some of the topics. So one of them is Skywalker. So tease the audience with why you use that phrase and what it means to you. Skywalker window, actually.
I ended up coming up with this analogy, and maybe one of the curses of being a speechwriter is you tend to think in analogies too much. My wife would certainly say that. But this one stuck in the book. There were plenty I took out. And to me, it feels like as much as we would like change to be a slow and deliberative process and a legislative process that can take years or decades, and that there's still value in that. A lot of the time, if we're going to make change in our current system of government, it looks like the end of episode 4 of Star Wars. So Luke Skywalker is, heading down this narrow little ravine in the Death Star, and there's a tiny window and a little opening, and you don't have a very long opportunity. But if you make that shot, if you take the right action at the right moment, the change is enormous and really, really quick. And so that's how I think about democracy and fixing our democracy is how can we make those changes that don't just affect one policy area or several policy areas, but how do we make the changes that make everything more easy? How do we make the change that makes change more possible in the future?
Okay, so let's fast forward. Imagine it is January 2021. Seems like a lifetime away, but let's just assume, and this isn't fantasy, but let's just assume that the president, the House, and the Senate all say, we want to reform our democracy. We want to be better. We want to perfect that union. If you were to advise them, where would you begin?
Well, one place I would start is to say we need to begin that process with a real reckoning of our history. And I particularly think about this right now as the protests continue across America and this uprising against racial injustice. One of the things that I have to say I certainly did not learn in high school was the ways that racism and white supremacy and the status quo are embedded in our political process in many cases. So the history is part of that. But let's say we have this moment, this Skywalker window, and we can really do some stuff. To me, there's 3 different categories. So number 1, how do we make sure everyone who wants to vote can vote? Number 2, how can we make sure that every vote really matters? And number three, how do we make sure that bills that have popular support and the approval of experts, so that both the populists and the elitists agree they're a good idea, how can we make sure at least those bills can become a law? So I think the quickest place I would start is automatic voter registration. I mean, we're going to talk about many other solutions, but for me, that seems like the clearest and least controversial idea. I mean, I'm sure people will come up with reasons they oppose it. They already have. But in so many other countries, voter registration, in most other countries, voter registration, they don't do the way that we do. And one of the things that I thought, what I kept going through the book, as Americans, we're so proud to be the oldest modern democracy, to be this example for other countries. So when other countries look at the way we do something like voter registration and say, no, thank you, that's not for us, that should also tell us maybe we're not doing that in the right way. So if we could make voter registration automatic, right away, politicians would have to listen to a lot more Americans than they have to listen to today. And the number of people who are barred from voting has just shot up in my lifetime.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that for a couple of reasons. Number one, for the last year or so, I have been a huge proponent of mandatory voting, which is a little one step further than what you're proposing. And I got this idea when I was talking to an Australian. They have mandatory voting there, and there's not a high penalty if you don't vote. It's like $25, but everybody votes because it's a culture shift. And she said, look, if everybody had to vote, politicians would be forced to be more accountable to those in the middle and not just simply go after a small sliver of the base, because they would know everybody would be voting. And I will mention, and I did in the introduction, that I chair the board of When We All Vote. And it's an organization that Michelle Obama launched a couple of years ago. It's designed to actually change the culture in our country around voting, meeting people where they are, and specifically looking at closing the age gap. Evidence shows that people vote in their first election, they're more likely to become lifelong voters, and also the race gap, because we know in too many of our communities, people of color are disenfranchised through policies, practices, and procedures, and even laws. And so we were troubled after the last presidential election that over 100 million people didn't vote, to your point, David. And how do we meet them and draw a nexus between their lives and the issues that they care about and voting, and ensure that they are informed voters, and ensure that they're not just voting for the president in one election or one candidate, but that they understand it matters who's on your school board in the current climate, who the prosecutors are, who's the mayor, who's in the state legislature drawing the lines for redistricting and allocating resources, who's in the executive branch and in the legislative branch providing the important checks and balances. And it is so hard to do it, but I'm encouraged to see, even in this climate, and we'll get more to voting later, that people do want to show up and engage, and I think are becoming more informed voters. But to go back to your book, so you do talk about HR 1 in your book, which is kind of ma and apple pie, making it easier to vote, making sure that there are ethics rules that members of Congress follow, et cetera. But describe a little bit of it and what you would want to do to change it.
Well, so HR 1, as I'm sure many of you watching this know, was the first bill that the Congress passed in after the 2018 midterms. And it has tons of really good ideas, including voter registration, automatic voter registration. It includes better public financing for campaigns, all sorts of things that are core ideas in democracy reform. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is, I will say, and the Brennan Center does a fairly good job of avoiding this problem, to all of your credit, but a lot of political reformers who have these big important ideas try, it seems, to make their ideas seem as uninteresting and unimportant as possible. And so my big change with HR 1 would be, we need to call it something other than HR 1. And I know it technically had another name as well, but you still hear about HR 1, and that indicates to people who work in Congress that it's very important, but most Americans do not work in Congress. And so the way we talk about these issues shouldn't be as obscure elements of political science. These questions of how our elections are run, who gets to register, who gets to vote, how we fund our campaigns, these are basic questions about what it means to be American, and also about whether we can change our country together. So we should approach these questions like these important and also inspiring ideas that I think they are.
You're touching on something that was my pet peeve, as you well know, when we worked together in the White House, and that is there's one vocabulary in Washington, and then there's a very different vocabulary outside of Washington. And since when I arrived in Washington back in 2009, I was a newcomer. I started in my career in local government in Chicago, and in fact said I would never, ever, under any circumstances, work for the federal government. Why? Because I felt it was so detached and removed from the issues that were important to the lives of the people I was trying to help in Chicago. And I used to always say, why do we have to tailor our hopes and dreams into the programs from the federal government? Why can't the federal government tailor all of their resources to be specific to the needs that we have on the ground? And I found when I arrived in Washington, there was like this club of people who knew what reconciliation and filibuster and omnibus and all these, and I'm like, speak to me in English, will you please? And so I think that's part of where the chasm is between we the people and those who elect us, because we're not even speaking in the same language. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that there is this category of things. If something is really important and also most people don't know a lot about it, that is an area that's always ripe for exploitation. I think I talk about that in the book in the sense of committee assignments. Which committee you're on, if you're a legislator, matters a lot, but most Americans don't know how much it matters. And so that's right off the bat, that combination means somebody's going to take advantage of that fact. So I did write this thinking, the more Americans who understand how this stuff works, you mentioned the filibuster and reconciliation, and those are both things that I talk about in the book. And I tried to sort of think about this in the sense of, I started out as a field organizer, talking with volunteers on the Obama campaign in '08. So if I was in Worcester, Ohio, talking with one of my volunteers and about why this matters, how would I want to describe that? How would I have that conversation in a way that leaves somebody whose full-time job is not politics, but they care about this, they know how important it is? How would I leave that person with an understanding that helps them be a participant in all of this work? And I think that gap is very, sometimes the other thing is, this book, my first book, wasn't about knowing very much other than what happened to me, as a memoir. This book I really researched. And so now I'm a person who knows things, which is very new to me. As you know, Valerie, I'm a communications person, not a policy person. I'm still not a policy person. But sometimes when you know a lot of stuff, you want to prove how much you know. So you want to be able to say, oh, well, we could solve that through reconciliation. And what you really are saying is, isn't it cool that I know what reconciliation means and maybe you don't? And it is cool. I sometimes fall into that trap now myself, but it doesn't actually work, because then there's that disconnect you just described. And so it's so important that we figure out how to take these complicated ideas and put them into English, and then also connect them to values that are not about, systemic reform or, structural democracy change. I mean, I told people when I was working on the book, my goal is to write a book about structural democracy reform without ever using the phrase structural democracy reform. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't done a find in Word yet, but I'm pretty sure I succeeded.
Well, you're exactly right. My other pet peeve were the use of acronyms. We gave everything an acronym. But what I realized is that, sure, it was a shortcut for us, but when we said the acronym, the public had no idea what we were talking about. And so figuring out like ACA. Well, people turned it into Obamacare for political reasons, but it's the Affordable Care Act. That means so much more than ACA. And
Right.
So when we do the shortcut, I think we heard, to your point, delivering of the message, because we should be reinforcing through storytelling what all of these laws do that connects back to people's life. And when you say affordable health care, well, everybody knows that's something that should be important to them, right? But they have no idea what ACA or Obamacare mean, other than if it's told to you in a political lens and you shouldn't like it. One of my best examples would be, someone did some polling in Kentucky, and they said, how do you feel about Obamacare? Oh, it's terrible. I can't stand Obamacare. Well, what about Kentucky Connect? How do you feel about that? Kentucky Connect has changed my life. Well, guess what, buddies? They're the same thing.
Right.
That's why I think communication has to be constantly in the minds of lawmakers, or else they lose their audience, and it's the most important audience of all, the people who voted them in. Mm-hmm. So speaking of voting, one of the topics that you mentioned in your book was that you believe that actually voting is immigration, rather, is a voting issue. And you know, because you were there, how hard we tried to get comprehensive immigration reform through Congress. One of the more frustrating disappointments that we had. But tell us why you consider immigration to be a voting issue.
So I'll just start with one of the things that I think if I had to pick one thing that I was most surprised by when I researched the book, I'll share two. One is that the House of Representatives used to have a filibuster, which totally shocked me. The other is the number of states that at one point allowed non-citizens to vote. And so I'll just let everyone watching take a guess as to how many states at one point allowed non-citizens to vote. 38 states. So nearly 80% of our country at one point allowed non-citizens to vote. And when you think about it, non-citizen voting when this country started made sense because everybody was new to America, because America was brand new. And also because this idea of taxation without representation worked in reverse, that if you paid taxes, there was a sense that you should be represented. And of course, a lot of people were left out of voting, as we know, when the country started, but non-citizens were not among that group. Now, over time, in the last 100 years, non-citizen voting has basically gone away. But what we replaced it with was the ability for people to earn citizenship. So in the 1960s, we had major immigration reform. In the 1980s, we had major immigration reform. And then we basically stopped. And one of the things that shocked me about that is that because we stopped, we have more and more people who have lived here for a very long time, either because they came here legally and are green card holders, or because they're undocumented but have been here for more than 10 years. That's the number I picked in the book for just people whose home is the United States, and they can't vote. And so people who are living here and can't vote are becoming a second class of citizens, or in this case of non-citizens. And one of the things that really stunned me was that Rush Limbaugh actually said in 2018, he said he would be fine allowing every undocumented immigrant to become a citizen, which, by the way, I think would have been really nice to know back when we were trying to get immigration reform done. But he said he would be fine with that as long as those formerly undocumented immigrants couldn't vote for 15 or 25 years. So if you think about that, what he was saying is this actually isn't about economic anxiety, and it's not even about white nationalism. It's about the fear that if we allow immigrants to become citizens and earn their voting rights, they're not going to vote for people who I like. And the way that I think about it is, well, yeah, that's how a democracy works. If people live here and they have skin in the game, and by the way, in many cases, can fight in our military. Green card holders serve in our military, and yet they don't have the right to vote. And of course, voting has always been tied to military service. So my point here, I was talking with a member of Congress about this and about some of the ideas in my book, and he said, "So you're saying we should pass a voting bill before we pass an immigration bill?" And I said, sort of, but not quite. I actually think we should pass an immigration bill as a voting bill, because mass citizenship is a form of mass enfranchisement. And so these things go hand in hand. And I think the more we can figure out the ways that these things are connected, the better we're going to do. Valerie, to your point about if we have that Skywalker window in January 2021, as you had kind of started things off by discussing.
Yes, well, and obviously there's a long history in our country of trying to disenfranchise the African American community. And I don't think Rush Limbaugh would feel the way he did when years ago that he does now. I think he's evolved, and now he's against immigration at all. In fact, let's just deport everybody. But the African American community has had challenges as a result of laws that have been passed that were clearly discriminatory. And young people too. One of my favorite examples of disenfranchisement is in the state of Texas. So if you have your license to carry firearms in Texas, you can use that to register to vote. But if you have your student identification because you attend one of the universities, that's not good enough. So there are obviously more blatant ones than that, but making it onerous to vote, Georgia passed a couple of laws while Stacey Abrams was running, and the Secretary of State who was running against her, to make it more difficult, to heighten the test to prove your identification. When in fact in our country, hey, guess what, everybody? And obviously our friends at the Brennan Center know this. There is no vote fraud in this country. It's de minimis. And trying to solve a minor problem with a sledgehammer is ridiculous. And well, I digress. Let's get back to your book. So you mentioned the filibuster, and we also talked earlier, David, about how you travel the country and you talk to a lot of folks, but you also talk to some folks inside, like one of our former colleagues, Marty Payani. So tell me a bit what he said about the filibuster and why you found it so interesting.
So I will talk about that conversation with Marty, but first I actually wanted to digress and go back to your digression
Okay.
About voter fraud, because I think it's, we hear these claims about fraud. One of the things that I think is really important to point out is that people have claimed to be fighting voter fraud in the service of disenfranchising eligible voters basically since the start of American history. Women could legally vote in New Jersey for the first few years of the 1800s. And when lawmakers passed a law disenfranchising women, they said they were fighting fraud. And of course they weren't. And the other thing that I found really remarkable is that if you took, so this was the in-person voter fraud, which is the particular type that many people claim to be concerned about. If you took a line of voters, a human chain of voters from New York all the way across the country to Seattle, down to Los Angeles, over to New Orleans, which would be an enormous, not possible in the age of social distancing, but still, if you had that enormous human chain, on average, one of those voters would be committing fraud. So when you say de minimis, I'm not a lawyer, so I feel the same way that I do about, that you do about some of the DC terms, where I think it's difficult to explain just how small a problem in-person voter fraud is. I think when I kind of ran some numbers, I think voter fraud would swing a presidential election sometime around the year 120 million AD. So it's very hard to overstate how few elections are being influenced by fraud. So to move just for a second to Marty and the filibuster. So Marty, as you know, Valerie, was kind of the rules guru for Democrats in the Senate for about 30 years. And his job was to know procedure backwards and forwards. And so he came to the Obama White House. He was the legislative affairs guy for the Senate. And I went to talk to him about the filibuster because I wasn't sure where we should land on this. And I was expecting that he would, as an institutionalist, give me some reasons that I would say we can reform the filibuster, but we shouldn't get rid of it. And that would make me look like a very reasonable person in this book. And, books are a great chance to look very reasonable. And in the end, what shocked me, and it wasn't just Marty, but other experts too, they ended up saying, the filibuster has a function. And if we get rid of it, it will lead to some unintended consequences, and we shouldn't sugarcoat that. But at the same time, the moment that Mitch McConnell and his caucus feel that the legislative filibuster is no longer helping them, it's gone. So the question with the filibuster is not if, it's when. And that changed my mind entirely. And then the question becomes, if the filibuster is at some point going away, then who's going to be in charge with that new power when that happens? And so that's why I ended up feeling that if we're in a situation, and when I say we here, I just mean people who are committed to democracy. It doesn't have to be of any one party. But if people who are committed to making democracy work have a majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House, but they can't get to 60 votes, which is the threshold that you need for a filibuster, then it's time to get rid of it. And I think, there will be unintended consequences with that. That's the history of the filibuster, but I do think it's worth doing.
All right. So let's go back to voting for a second, because there's really much to unpack there. So everyone, of course, saw the lines in Georgia and Wisconsin in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people were being forced to choose between exercising their right as citizens to vote and their health, something that we would all say should be quite objectionable. But the lines didn't begin then. I remember back in 2012, when President Obama was running for his second term, traveling down to Florida because we knew that the ballot there was pretty long, and so we were anticipating, even during early vote, that there would be lengthy lines. And I went down there right in the middle of the early vote period, and in Miami, and I went out to one of the polling places, and the line was around the block. And I will say, part of my job was to say, please don't leave the line, stay, don't go away. And what was reassuring was so many people said to me, honey, don't you worry, I have my chair, I have my bucket of fried chicken, I have a little bit to drink, and I will be here for as long as it takes. And I think part of that was the passion with which people felt about voting for President Obama. But why did the ballot have to be that long? Why did they add all of those referendums onto the ballot? Why? Because they were trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. And when you layer on what we've been seeing of late, and who knows what the circumstances will be by November, but let's plan for the worst and hope for the best is always my motto. And so to the points that you've been talking about, David, 3 policy changes that When We All Vote proposed. Number 1, everyone should be able to vote by mail. Again, this notion that there is fraud in vote by mail is nonsense. The military has been voting by mail since the Civil War. Washington State only allows vote by mail, and there is no fraud. But in order to do that, we need to have the post office have the resources, additional resources it needs to accommodate what we know will be an influx in ballots. And I have a friend in New York who tried to vote absentee in Georgia. She requested it back in March. She never did get her absentee ballot. So we know there's a challenge right there. The other thing, we should be able to register online. With technology being what it is, we should be able to do that. It should be so easy to do that. And we should expand the early vote. Again, but even before the pandemic, people can't always take off work on a Tuesday.
Yep.
If something comes up, a sick child, a sick parent, you have an exam, you forget, you sleep in, whatever. Make it easier for people to vote by expanding. So those are 3 simple things that could be done. And to this notion about everybody can do something, when I was in San Francisco a while ago, I met a woman who would take her ironing board to naturalization ceremonies. And afterwards, she'd register everybody who came out. To your point about it should be automatic. Why are we not making it easier to vote? What say you on this topic, David?
I would say, the short answer is we're not making it easier to vote on purpose. The challenge in the United States has been for the last 40 years that I would say since the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, public opinion has said voting is a right. But our election laws continue to act as though voting is a privilege. And our systems of elections continue to be based on this idea that voting is a privilege. And actually, it turns out even the word franchise, I was trying to figure out why is it that we use the same word franchise for talking about the right to vote and also about the right to, open a Burger King. And it's because it's this idea of a special privilege that is being conferred to you either by the American state or by Burger King headquarters. But either way, that's what it means to be enfranchised. Whereas voting, by the way, comes from the Latin word to vow, which is something everyone can do. So I think of us as this tension between voting and the franchise. And one of the ways that politicians have always sought to win elections is not just by persuading voters to agree with them, but by taking voters who might not agree with them and keeping them from voting. I mean, this was something, I wrote something about this recently, I thought about this in the context of the protests, that so many of the communities that are most impacted by police violence, that are impacted by systemic racism in all kinds of ways, are also the communities where voting rights have been under attack for years and years and years, for decades. And so we're in this situation where people say, well, if I can keep you from voting, either by taking away your voting rights or just by making the lines incredibly long or making the process very complicated, if I can keep you from voting, I don't have to listen to your problems. I was on an event, like an Instagram event earlier today, and someone commented and they said, well, when people who don't vote have no right to complain. And I saw that kind of scroll through the thing, and I said, I actually need to stop that, because I did hear that growing up. And I heard it from liberals and conservatives, not just from one side or the other. But actually, it's not that people who don't vote have no right to complain. In millions and millions of cases, it's the opposite. It's that people can't complain because they have no ability to vote. And the reason we're not doing more is often intentional. The one thing I will add quickly to that is long lines are not just a problem in some states or other states. In some states, you have a problem where, for example, one of the things that I care a lot about is the poll worker shortage we're facing in America. So here's an example of a great solution. In Cincinnati, they said high school kids can take the day off to work the polls. So they deal with their poll worker shortage. They get all these young poll workers who are very energetic. They understand the technology really well. And these young kids get a civics lesson in the process. And so they're solving all of these problems all at once. In many, many other parts of the country, we're not being as creative about it. And so there's a combination of incompetence and also intentional incompetence.
A really good suggestion. So I was remiss. I meant to mention at the beginning that in about 5 minutes, I'm going to pause, even though I have like 100 more questions for David, and I'm going to give you, the audience, a chance to ask some questions. So I've been noticing that you guys have done this before, and there are some questions in the Q&A. So we'll be shifting to that. So now's a good time. If you have a question for David, pop it in, and we'll make sure that he answers it. But in our time left, I do want to talk about one. I have so many pet peeves, but another pet peeve of mine is the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, which you do talk about also in your book. So give us a sense about what are some practical steps that we can take there, because what it does is obviously it takes away from the voice of the individual by putting so much money into the mix, because corporations can write these huge checks. It's why we have all this dark money. It has, I think, really corrupted the process and made it very difficult for politicians who want to have that nexus between themselves and the voters, because there's this big gorilla in the room. So talk a bit about Citizens United.
So to research Citizens United, I went to Las Vegas to spend some time in one of Sheldon Adelson's casinos. And Sheldon Adelson, for those of you who don't know, is probably the biggest donor to conservative causes. And we don't know who the biggest donor is because so much money is now being donated in secret. I didn't learn a ton from that particular visit, but I did lose some money. So there was that. What I learned when I got back home and kind of dove into more traditional forms of research is that the way that I would describe Citizens United to somebody who's never heard of it before is that it's not just a court case. We already have elections in the United States where the amount of money you have is directly tied to how much power you have. They're shareholder elections. So in a public company, the more shares you own, the more power you get. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of the way that's the way companies are run. What Citizens United did was take that process and directly apply it to the elections that decide who is in charge of our country in so many different ways. To say the more you invest in the political process through donations, the more power you get, the more influence you get. And one of the decisions that Roberts handed down, and this was not in Citizens United, but in one of the follow-ups, was to say essentially that's fine, that if you donate more, you get more influence. And also you can donate basically unlimited amounts. And so it is going to be very difficult to do something about Citizens United because it's going to take, either a constitutional amendment or major changes on the Supreme Court. But there are some things that can lessen the impact of Citizens United that are pretty easy. One of the ones that I talk about in the book is this thing that they're doing in Seattle. They have something called democracy bonds. So for you get basically a $25 gift card for being a Seattle citizen, and you can donate your gift card to either liberal causes, conservative causes, politicians, you name it, or you can just say forget it and the money goes back to the Treasury. But what this does is it gives everyone $25 to donate to a politician. And so the total amount of money being put into the system by small dollar donors goes way up, and it reduces the impact of money being put into the system by large donors. And Rick, I forget if I'm pronouncing his last name wrong, Rick Hasen, I believe, who wrote a book called Plutocrats United. He talks about this as an idea called leveling up. So there's leveling down, making it harder for wealthy donors to have as much influence, and there's leveling up, which is making it easier for the rest of us to have influence. And I think leveling up is probably more likely to survive a constitutional challenge. And I say that as someone who is definitely not a constitutional scholar, but that's my impression of it.
All right, so just we have time for one more before we go to the questions. And so as President Obama has always said, good is better. And I think when we imagine a better political process, what do you think that looks like? And just to give everyone context, David is very familiar with this, but we often try to do everything. And we thought, well, let's go for as much as we can possibly get. And when we would push as hard as we could, inevitably we had to compromise. And so if any of us looked disappointed, President Obama would say to us, good is better than the alternative. Good is how we got the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than what we had before. And so it was kind of his guiding principle. But tell us what good would look like here. And then we're going to get to I'm skimming. There's some great questions here for you.
Excellent. Well, so this is actually an excellent chance because I also brought your book, Valerie. So yeah, I can, I Vanna Whited my book earlier. Now I can Vanna White your book.
And actually, put yours up again, because one of the questions is people didn't see yours. You didn't hold
Oh,
it.
yes.
Right? Everybody got it? Get a screenshot. Go buy it.
Everyone can take a screenshot. You can go to my personal website, Amazon.com. I'm kidding, by the way. You should go to Books Are Magic, which is sponsoring this event. I mean that. Books Are Magic is great. And actually, one of the things, I'll jump back into the question, but one of the things that I think has been very exciting about the book world during the pandemic has been the way that bookshop.org, for those of you who may not know about it, has, and some other things have come to support independent bookstores right now, which has been, we're talking about things that are good. And I think that is something that has been, it's been hopeful to see people come together in that way. So anyway, all of that is to say, in your book, Valerie, you talked about this idea that I'm paraphrasing you, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you talked about this idea that you learned in city government, which is that in a good compromise, everybody walks away a little bit unhappy. And I think that's an important part of public service that I think is very hard to wrap one's head around. That if you're going into public service because you think it's going to make you very, very happy all the time, it's not. But what it is it can make you very satisfied and very fulfilled, because you can look at moments and say, this is unquestionably better than it was yesterday. We're living in a better country today than we were yesterday. I was thinking about the Supreme Court's decision, a sort of rare, joyful Supreme Court decision.
Unbelievably joyful and unexpected, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just, that is not something that gives me too much hope as I think about the rest of the term and where we're headed with the court. But that moment where, and sometimes it happens with Supreme Court decisions because they're so sudden, where you can say at 10 a.m. the country became a little bit better, and that's an incredible thing.
Well,
so
we should say the court ruled
yes,
that employers cannot discriminate against the LGBTQ community in hiring decisions and firing decisions, and so they're protected now in a way that they were not the day before.
And as we talk about what better would look like, one of the things I think is really remarkable is that even, I saw a poll from 2013 where 56% of Americans agreed that you should not be able to discriminate against someone in the workplace for being gay. But because of our political process, we had to wait 7 or 8 more years for a conservative court to give us these rights, as opposed to being able to win those rights through legislation, through the legislative process. So to me, what better looks like is when the American people agree that we really want something, and also when we agree, when it doesn't violate basic rights, and when the sort of consensus among the people who know the issue the best, when we're all on the same page, we should be able to get that done. So I don't think that if you, for example, went through my book and passed every single solution into law, we would solve climate change, or we would end gun violence, or we certainly wouldn't end systemic racism, or totally reform policing the way that we clearly need to. What we would do is restore the basic idea in our country, which is that we can solve our problems together. And I think the alternative is not dysfunction and plodding forward. I think there was this sense that maybe we can just muddle our way through it. But what we're seeing is there's going to be, if we can't get the process to work so that democracy gets people what they want, at least some of the time, then the alternative is not going to be a failing democracy. The alternative is going to be authoritarianism, because in today's environment, authoritarians are not staging coups; they're making sales pitches. Right? It's a kind of a spin on Winston Churchill's old quote. He said democracy is the best form of government, or the worst form of government, other than all those that have ever been tried.
I love that quote.
It's a great quote. But today you see authoritarians all over the world saying, well, democracy is the worst form of government you've ever tried. Why not try something else? And the problem with authoritarianism is you don't get a return policy. Once you decide to go that direction, you don't get to say, oh, actually, Churchill was right on that one. Let's go backwards. And so I do think that that idea that you alluded to, that President Obama has articulated so often, that good is better, is really at the heart of a democratic process. And I hope it's at the heart of this book, too.
Okay, so now it's the audience's turn. And just a heads up, you have 68 questions. Spoiler alert, we're not going to get to them all, but we're going to get to some that I've decided I'm picking out. So the first one I really like. It's from Victor Shy, he says he's an incoming freshman at UCLA, and his question is this: do you think that the polarization we're experiencing now affects the potential of making the structural reforms necessary to our democracy? And if so, how do we start to reform our fragile democracy?
So, Victor, I think that's a great question, because there's this the overarching in all of this is this idea of we're more polarized than we used to be. And that's certainly true in the level of our politics, but it's also increasingly true within neighborhoods and just in terms of voters. And that's just a fact of American life right now. The question is polarization driving the structural problems we're facing, or are the structural problems creating polarization? And I think the answer is a little bit of both, but I think we discount the amount that structural problems lead to polarization. Valerie, you and I were talking about this about 20 or so minutes ago, this idea that if everyone could vote, then politicians would have to be moving more toward persuading people, toward saying, who is the median voter? Who's the person in the center who I can win over with my ideas? And once that happens, the polarization by definition goes down a little bit. And there's other things we can do. Just as an example, ranked choice voting, which is a way of, rather than just voting for your favorite candidate, you vote for a list of candidates that you rank in order of preference. And I go through it in more detail in the book because it's a little complicated, but the way it basically works is it makes sure that your vote counts, that you can vote for your top choice, but you won't waste your vote. And if you had that in party primaries, you would have more candidates running as a consensus candidate who says, hey, I might not be the first choice of the most voters, but I'm the second choice of so many voters that's my route to winning the election. And once you start to have that, to a large extent, these things follow trends. I do think you would see less polarization from the top. And I think that sense of coming back together and reaching toward consensus would then start to trickle down to other parts of American life.
Great. Now, this is a question I often get. So I think I'm curious of your thought. This is from Derek. He says, in working on changing the culture around voting and participation, what do you think it would take for there to be a federal holiday on Election Day? And I do want to give a shout out. There are increasing number of employers who have announced in the last week that they are going to give their workers a paid day off on Election Day. But David, what are your thoughts on a federal holiday?
Well, this is one of those things where I'm probably against the grain of most people who think the way I do about democracy. I think that a federal Election Day holiday, it's not a bad idea, but I don't think that it actually would make nearly as big an impact as we think. And the reason is, Valerie, what you just alluded to. The real question is, so many people don't get federal holidays off. So you would need to make sure that it's a federal holiday, and also people who work jobs where you don't get those federal holidays off are able to get that day off. If we were moving around the timing of Election Day, the thing I would be most inclined to do, if I could wave a magic wand, would be to move Election Day to a Sunday, and then have mandatory early voting all day Saturday, and then essentially you would replace Election Day with election weekend. And to some extent, the more you get into this stuff, the more you start to do these, like, all right, if you could design a government from scratch, what would it look like? But I do think that's the way that I tend to think about it. I don't think it's a bad idea at all, and I think particularly what you just alluded to, I think companies absolutely should be giving the day off to employees to go vote. The other thing that I will say, in addition to the idea of a federal holiday, which again we could do, and all it would take is a law. A lot of states
and a lot of money.
Okay, that's fair, and a lot of money. But a lot of states have time off. You're required to give your employees time off to vote, but those laws are often pretty toothless. They're very hard to enforce. They sort of assume, this often happens in elections, the burden is on the voter. So you have to prove that you took that time off to vote, as opposed to it being assumed that, okay, you went and waited to vote. And by the way, if you're in a 4-hour long line to vote, then often you don't get that time off, because even generous states don't give you 4 hours. So states could also do a huge amount here by changing their laws to say, if you're stuck online for 4 hours, then then your employer has to give you the amount of time it takes to vote. And also making these laws much more enforceable, and removing the burden of proof on the voter to have to prove that they were trying to vote. We should trust people enough. And I think what would happen, by the way, is if you did that, politicians would have less of an incentive to create those long lines. So these things can be a virtuous circle where the more we help everybody vote, the less inclined politicians will be to make it harder for people to vote.
Now, several people have been commenting that as we're talking in somewhat idealistic ways, that we haven't really focused on impediments like gerrymandering. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, gerrymandering is an extraordinarily important issue in American life, and it's really complicated. I mean, I sort of discovered as I was working on the book. I think that's I don't think my editor is watching, but if she were on this Zoom, I think she would agree that that's the chapter that took the longest to get right. Because hating gerrymandering is very simple, and understanding gerrymandering is much more difficult. So the first thing that I think is very important to understand in American life today is the unfairness that takes place that actually isn't about drawing unfair districts. So over the last 20 or so years, we've seen this acceleration of a trend where Democrats increasingly live in cities and Republicans increasingly live outside cities. And what that means is Democrats are packed together in these dense urban areas, and that makes it very, very difficult to draw districts that would be fair or would be competitive. An example, New York City, where I grew up and where I'm sure a lot of you are watching from right now, if you took my apartment on 86th Street, where I grew up, you can't find a precinct that voted for Trump. You'd have to go like deep into New Jersey. You can't draw a district that is not going to be deep, deep blue, and that means that it's going to waste a lot of votes. So that's the part where gerrymandering isn't affecting things. But then you add on top of that the most aggressive gerrymandering we've ever seen. The University of Chicago, the law school, which is not a liberal institution, they did a study and they found that the scope and skew, I think that was their words, of gerrymandering after the 2010 redistricting cycle, when legislators could draw new lines, was unprecedented in American life. And so the way I describe it is almost like a case of arson in the aftermath of a forest fire. A lot of this is happening because of demographic trends, but then on top of that, people are rewriting districts or redrawing districts to make it almost impossible to get people in power out of power if we decide that they're not doing a good job. And so, I think the most telling quote in all this, in Wisconsin, which is a state that comes up a lot in any book about how democracy needs to be working better. In Wisconsin, in the state assembly, Democrats won the most votes. They won a majority of the votes cast. Republicans won not just a majority of seats, but a huge majority of seats. And when they asked the assembly speaker, well, how is this fair? He said, well, Republicans would have had the majority of seats if Madison and Milwaukee weren't counted. And the thing about Madison and Milwaukee that I point out in the book, and this took a great deal of research, is that people lived there. So of course they should be counted. But this idea that, we don't need to count people who don't agree with us, it is so antithetical to democracy, and it's happening all the time. And I will say that was way too long an answer, so I'll try to make the other ones much shorter.
No, but it was good. It was robust. So a few people have raised something that Shelley Friedman-Rosh raised, so I'll read her question. How do you think we can counter the cynics, especially young 20 and 30-something cynics who are ridden with disillusionment? And it is true, disproportionately young people don't vote, notwithstanding the evidence that shows that if they do, they become lifelong voters. Since you're closer to that age than I am, David, let's say you.
So what I would say is, to some extent, you have to meet people where they live, meet people where they live. And I feel like that was a phrase that I heard a lot in the Obama administration as well. And you need to recognize that if you're voting in your first election, democracy has never functioned particularly well in your lifetime. In fact, 2 of the 5 presidential elections you can remember, the people chose one president and they got a different president. So I understand why people feel disillusioned, especially young people, and why people feel cynical. I think that's one of the reasons that I wrote this book, was to, rather than say, no, don't worry, the system is working fine, which just doesn't pass the smell test, to say, if we understand the tools that we have available to us, yes, they're not all working the way they're supposed to, but we can fix the problems we have with the tools we have. And I think we can point more and more toward examples where that really does make a difference. And this was something certainly that was an important part of what we were doing and trying to do in the Obama administration, which was making that connection between decisions made by our leaders and decisions made by ordinary Americans, and then the impact of those decisions on Americans' lives. And I think that fundamental process is still possible. And then the other thing I will say, which is a little less airy and a little bit more concrete, we need to be paying a lot more attention to local elections. So it is very hard to get people to see a big picture. That's just the nature of a big picture. But who's your mayor? Who's your city council person? Who's writing those basic laws? We're seeing this right now in all of these debates about policing. This stuff is so important, and it's also much more immediate. So if I was talking to a group of young voters, I think I would start with local and go national, where I think often we've tended to start national and go local.
So a few people want to know how to get involved. I already told you about When We All Vote. It's a nonpartisan effort to change the culture around voting. People are saying, what do you do? Given that we're in a pandemic, go online, whenweallvote.org. Dave, are there any other several people are asking for organizations. Are there any organizations you want to shout out?
So I would say, and it's not just because we're talking, I would say if I was having this conversation with someone else, I would still say When We All Vote is a fantastic organization that is trying to make a real change on these issues. All on the Line, which I believe is nonpartisan, that's another organization that is really focused on gerrymandering and bringing this issue to the fore, because that gerrymandering used to be one of those issues that we talked about, which was really important, but no one cared about it. And it's taken a lot of hard work, but I think that's changed. It's still important, but people care about it now. And so it's much harder to get away with stuff you shouldn't be able to get away with. I'm trying to think of other organizations that I think are doing the best work. The Brennan Center clearly is an organization I think is terrific, but you probably know about the Brennan Center if you're here. The other thing that I will say is that whether or not you have an organization, small changes make an enormous impact here. So particularly if you are a young person or you know a young person, which means you move around a lot, which makes it harder to get registered and stay registered. Asking people to register, but also making sure they check their registration to confirm that they're registered in this age of voter purges is really important. And so little things like that, you don't need to wait to find an organization to tell you what to do. Often it's just as simple as going to the people in your life and saying, are you registered? Have you double checked? Have you applied for that absentee ballot? Did you get it yet? If you haven't gotten it yet, who should you complain to? And if we all did just a little bit of that, we would live in a different country. And it's an extraordinary thing to think about, but just a couple more of those things we each did would change America completely.
So a few people have asked this in the same kind of a theme, given the entrenchment of special interests, and people describe various ones, given the role of the media that has changed over the years, given kind of all of the headwinds, what's something concrete that the people who are tuning in, and you got a lot of folks listening, what can they do today to try to make sure that their voices are heard and that they can move the needle? And you've talked about this a little bit, but since so many people have raised that, I just want to give you another chance to go at it.
Yeah, let me give you a really concrete thing. When you mentioned media, I'm one of those people that is quite frustrated with Facebook, but I'm not one of those people who's deleted their Facebook account, and I don't think you should. And the reason is because pushing back against misinformation in this current electoral climate is going to be very important. And a specific type is going to involve when ballots are counted in 2020. This is one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot right now. And I thankfully, there's a lot of people who are smarter than me who are thinking about it a lot, which is more important. A lot of states are doing the right thing. And they're saying if a ballot is postmarked by Election Day, it's counted, even if it's not received by Election Day. So you can drop your ballot off in the mail on Tuesday, and it shows up, in the central counting center on Friday, and it's still counted. The problem is, and we saw this in 2018 because some states already do this, we are in an environment where politicians are discrediting elections that they think they might not win. And what we saw in 2018 was a number of elections that got decided, the election night vote said one thing, but there were all these completely valid votes coming in later. And politicians said, oh, no, we should only count the election night votes, even though that would mean discarding thousands or millions of completely legal, valid votes. And that's only going to be a bigger problem this year because so many state laws have changed very quickly. And again, those changes are good, but if we allow those changes to become an excuse to discredit an election with false claims of fraud, then we could be in some real trouble. So if you are looking to do something, one of the most important things you can do is know the laws in your state. And if your state is one of the ones that is counting ballots after Election Day, legal ballots after Election Day, let people know. And similarly, politely but firmly, if people try to falsely cast doubt on an election, don't wait for some authority figure to correct the record. Unfortunately, the way that America works now and the way media works now is that's on all of us. So I would say that's actually one thing that is so important and anyone can do. And you don't have to do it in a rude way. I'm not advocating for like more nastiness on the internet because it has plenty, but it's something that we absolutely should be thinking about.
That's good. Well, it's 7:00, and so we're going to close, but I want you to have the last word before I wrap. And I ask everybody this question because I think in these challenging times where we're going through so much in our country, and obviously I'm a lot older than you. I still remember the civil rights movement. This moment does feel more inclusive, not only around our country, but also around the world. What gives you hope, David?
Well, first of all, before I answer that, let me just quickly again thank the Brennan Center for hosting this, Books Are Magic for hosting us, and everyone should, I'll do the book cover one last time. I hope you read the book and get it from Books Are Magic. It's a great bookstore. And obviously, this is bookstores are working so hard to serve their communities right now, especially. And Valerie, thank you for doing this. I am completely honored. I feel like, I think as you mentioned, this is, well, I guess it's the second best interview I've ever had with you. I'll put it that way. The one where you hired me was slightly better, but this was a close second. You asked what makes me hopeful. And this is a story I ended my last book with. In 2012, I got to write a speech for a woman named Stacy Lynn at the convention. She's not a politician. She's a mom. And her daughter, Zoe, had a congenital heart defect. And the Affordable Care Act, as Stacy put it, was saving her daughter's life. And so at the convention, Stacy brought out Zoe and she talked about what the Affordable Care Act was doing for Zoe. And for the end of my last book, I got to go to Arizona and watch Zoe, who has now grown into this karate chopping little kid, and think about how, we talk about how good is better, but that it's so clear to watch that when you see somebody, who might not have been alive if not for this decision made by this president in Washington. And now she's, trying for a yellow belt. And as it happens, a week or 2 weeks ago, I think it was a week ago, Stacy posted something else on social media. And I think Zoe's about 10 now. And there's a picture of Zoe. And Stacy said, "I'm so proud of her. She decided to do this all on her own." And Zoe was in their house and she was taking a knee. She was kneeling for 8 minutes and 46 seconds for George Floyd. And to me, that was just an extraordinary moment to see this idea that here was somebody who was quite literally, saved by America being at its best, but not just saying thank you and now I'm going to go live my own life. But even at 10, she's thinking, I want to be the kind of person who's there for somebody else who needs it. And I feel like if a 10-year-old gets that, then I think we're going to be okay. That's how I feel about it.
What a beautiful note to end. Well, before we close, in addition, of course, to thanking the Brennan Center for everything you do each and every day and also creating this forum for us tonight, I have 3 asks because I'm the moderator. I get to do that. So first of all, if you've not completed your census, please go to my2020census.gov and fill it out. I filled mine out online. I am not good online, as many of you who know me know that. But it was as simple as it could be, and it is so important. It will affect the resources that flow to your state, and we need you to do that. The Electoral College, all kinds of things are affected by our census count. And so make your voice count and fill out your form. Number 2, if you can sign up to vote by mail, do. And encourage everybody to do that as well so that we can try to alleviate some of the pressure on Election Day. And of course, if you don't do that, try, if you are in a state that allows for early vote, to go and vote early, again, alleviating that pressure. If you can't vote early or by mail in your state because it's prohibited, call your members of Congress, call your Secretary of State, call everybody who you vote for and let them know how unhappy you are with that and put pressure on them to change. We have seen just in the last few weeks how when good people come together and lift up their voices, change can happen swiftly. far swifter than we would have ever imagined even 6 months ago. So please let your voices be heard. Please join me in congratulating David on this incredible book, all the hard work that went into it, and his willingness to share his thoughts and to push the envelope, because again, that's how change happens. And thank you, David, for continuing to be hopeful. You know, we're all about hope and change. And nobody said it's easy. Nobody said it's anything to do with Pollyanna. It takes grit and determination and resilience to be a voice that tries to perfect our union. So I thank you for this book. Someone asked, was it on Audible? Yes, it is. So you can get it right on Audible as well. My last plug for the book today. And thank you all for sharing a portion of your evening. Your questions were terrific. I'm certainly sorry that we could not have gotten to more of them. I wish you all well and good night.